Hi, everyone. Welcome to Understanding Food Selectivity. This is a pre-recorded workshop developed by Kids Inclusive staff. This is the final video as part of a 3-video series to help families to identify challenges and learn new strategies to support food selectivity in their child's lives. My name is Sydney Hampton, and I'm an occupational therapist at Kids Inclusive. Let's get started. So before we start talking about food selectivity, I wanted to start with a couple disclaimers. So for this presentation, we're not targeting towards a specific population or diagnosis. In order to provide the most universal approach to care, we aim to provide a variety of strategies and considerations. Please know that not every strategy is going to be appropriate or work for every family, but we hope that from these presentations, you'll find something that you can take home. Another disclaimer that we want to share is in regards to language. So language is rapidly changing, and we continue to have ongoing discussions with the neurodiverse community. During this presentation, we'll be using both identity-first language, such as autistic person, as well as a person-first language, such as person with autism. So in today's video, we're going to target our last learning objective and hopefully help you build a toolbox full of strategies for supporting your child with selective eating. Not all strategies work for all children and family. However, if what you are doing is not effective, we invite you to be open-minded and considering some of what you hear today. Just a reminder that change takes time. The strategies and information presented today is not expected to provide immediate solutions, but hopefully build ideas for your daily routine that over time will help your child reach your goals. So we're going to move into expanding our food ranges. So there's a reason that we're chatting about this in our last part. It feels like throughout these different videos, you're going to want to work on just expanding your food ranges because you're going to think that that makes the most difference. But we have to consider making a positive meal environment and also developing a mealtime routine as an important foundation in order to work on expanding the food ranges. So without a positive association with sitting at the table, we can't expect our child to feel open and willing to try new foods. So with expanding food ranges, there are several approaches or strategies that we can use to try and expand. The strategy will depend on what you feel will work best for your child. The primary one that we're going to talk in today's presentation is called food chaining. So when introducing new foods, as I mentioned, we still want to focus on keeping mealtime positive. So for some, the goal is for all members of the family to like the same meal. Maybe it's one that's a frequent rotation in your meal planning. For others, it's for your child to eat at least one type of vegetable. No matter the goal, please remember that progress takes time. So with expanding food ranges, we're going to look at developing a food range list. We're going to then look at the similarities between those foods, relate that to what our child's goal is, and then it's going to in turn help us decide how to serve the food and then pick an approach that we can use during that routine and stick with it. So for making a food range list, this is a helpful starting point to kind of organize, okay, what goal foods do we want to work on with the child? It's also going to help connect any dots about what similar things about different types of food the child likes. This will help to decide, okay, what next food do we want to work on? So making a list of the different proteins your child eats, different carbohydrates and starches, and then fruits and vegetables. And then when you make that list, take a look at what are some similarities between the two. Do all the foods, are they crunchy when you eat them? Do they avoid certain textures? Do they avoid colors? Or are all of the foods that you've listed the same color? Understanding these preferences are going to be really helpful in determining those next steps. This chart can actually take one step further and break down the food a little bit more into a preferred food, the less preferred food, or the food that they sometimes eat, and then new foods. So this is going to help for a more restricted food range. It's going to help to organize foods based on their sensory components, like color or texture. If there's a certain color of food, like for instance, kids that really like beige foods, we're going to look at wanting to introduce foods that don't have a lot of color at first. That way, it's going to be very similar to their preferred foods, but it might make it into the category of a less preferred slash sometimes food. So relating to that color, if we're going to look at a beige food, well, we're not going to go right into introducing broccoli to them. That's going to be a really bright color for them that they're not prepared for, but maybe they'll tolerate cauliflower a little bit more than broccoli at the start. So once you've filled in your food range list, you're going to want to become a little bit of a detective. So figure out that taste. What's that flavor, that texture of the food, that shape, color, but also temperature and what the smell of the food is. So again, how I mentioned, we're going to look at what's similar and then what food can we relate to that. So knowing that all foods that your child already eats, from proteins, carbs, starches, fruits and veggies, we're going to look at again, what's going to be very similar, what can we integrate. One thing that we want to consider is what type of food do you want to introduce and what's going to be different for them. So some kids, they crave that predictability with food. And so knowing that every time they're going to eat that food, it's going to taste the same, it's going to make the same crunch, it's going to look the same every single time. When we introduce new foods to kids that crave that predictability, we can sometimes build a little bit of anxiety. So for example, with fruit and veggies, they're going to be different every single time you give it to the child. And for some, that's going to be really difficult when introducing a new food. So for example, look at a blueberry. Depending on what season you get that blueberry, if you get it from frozen or if you get it from fresh, it's going to be a different type of juiciness. It's going to be squishy. It could be sweet. It could be sour. And based on that, it's going to be a little bit trickier to introduce that new food to that child compared to like a box cracker. And that's going to look the same every single time. So this could be a reason why packaged or prepackaged foods tend to be a preferred food for your child. Those chicken nuggets from McDonald's are going to taste and look the same and the smell all the same time. So it's something that they can predict and feel comfortable with eating at each and every meal. So with all that predictability, how are we going to present our meal and try new foods with our child? So we're going to look next at meal presentation. So when we look at meal presentation, we want to look at 3 potential ways to offer that food. So for the first option, you could look at putting at least 1 protein, 1 starch, and 1 fruit or vegetable on the plate. It can start with being a preferred food for that child or change it just a little bit. The second option is going to be looking at offering a preferred food, a sometimes preferred food, and a new food. The child doesn't have to really touch that new food, but it's just going to be on the plate for them. The third option is going to offer the same food in 3 different presentations with different tastes, textures, shapes, colors, temperature, depending on what your child likes within that food range. So an example we can give to you for this option could be a cucumber. You're introducing a cucumber to a child, so you're going to give it to them whole, you can cut it into shapes, or you can cut it into strips. Those are 3 different ways that you're introducing that food to that child, but think about those textures that they like. Do they like it crunchy? So we're going to keep it in a stick form. We're not going to mush it down at all. Also thinking about that color. Well, if the child doesn't like the big green color, maybe peel the rind off the cucumber so it's a little bit less colorful for them. We can also look at different options for meal presentation, maybe looking at a buffet style. So this won't work for every child or every family, but for some children, building that sense of choice or autonomy can help with trying new foods. So during a meal, if they choose to have it put on their plate, they may be more likely to try it. It also helps to reduce the pressures. We also look at trying a learning plate. It can be used if you know your child doesn't tolerate new foods on their actual plate with food, but they may tolerate having it a little bit of exposure with the food being near them. There's also no pressure to eat from the learning plate, but just to explore that food. A discard plate can also have a similar effect. So for children that like to throw food off their plate because they never want to eat it, We can help to redirect them to, oh, let's just put it on this plate. You don't have to eat it, but we're just going to place it over here. I also want to mention with meal presentation is that it can take multiple exposures of just having the food near a child before they're actually going to be willing to touch and lead all the way to tasting and swallowing the food. So on average, it can take about 15 to 20 exposures for a child to even consider trying new food. And this isn't going to be the same for every child. It may take more than 20 exposures as well. So the key with exposure is that we don't want to force them to try it. It can be just starting to look at the plate and then maybe touching the food before we actually want them to try and eat it. With meal presentation as well, we want to consider portion sizes. So putting too much of a new food on a plate can be really overwhelming for a child. So when we're trying new foods, we recommend 1 teaspoon per year of their age of each of the new foods being presented. So for example, if you're going to put some more cucumbers on, give about 2 to 3 bites or 3 to 4 tablespoons of that food to try on their plate. That way, it's not going to be overwhelming to them, and they can try little bits if they want. You can also look at using a binder food that a child loves that can help with that presentation of new foods. So don't forget that just because what you think would be disgusting doesn't mean that your child will also think that it's disgusting. So you can offer it as a choice when you're trying those new foods. So offering a new type of meat on the plate and a child loves ketchup. Well, you can try it with ketchup. You might like the taste then. But the key with that binder food is we don't want it to hide the new foods. We don't want to trick the child at all. It's just to kind of add in that taste that you already know they like with maybe a new texture. So ideally, when trying new foods, we want to kind of prevent what we call food jags. So food jags are what are related to taste fatigue. These are when your child eats the same food prepared the same way every day or at every meal. The problem with food jags is that your child eventually gets burnt out of these foods and can permanently lose their food from that food range. So with food jags, we want to avoid offering one particular food every time we eat. Instead, offer it every other day or every other meal and limit offering it every time the child wants to eat. This will help to prevent and delay that food jag from happening. We also want to look at rotating those preferred foods and favorite foods out so that a child doesn't expect it at every meal and then reach their food jag or quota of that food earlier. Next, we're going to talk about food chaining, and this is to help prevent that food jags down the line. For do's and don'ts for meal planning, we want to look at the do's for presenting new foods in a low pressure way. We want to offer the child foods that they can explore at the meal times, but don't always have to eat, especially if it's brand new to the child. We want to look at offering choice when it's possible. When you offer that choice, that autonomy might help the child feel more confident with trying the new foods. So with a new food, we might, if it's a banana, do you want your banana cut up or do you want it whole? We want to look at offering safe foods with the new foods. So maybe out of that option plate, we look at 2 of them being a safe food for them, but one of them being a not so safe food or a food that they may eat. We also want to consider that time of day you offer that new food. So if it's a really stressful morning for the child and breakfasts are just really difficult for them, that's not a meal that we want to offer a new food. If they do really well at lunch or maybe even a snack time, that's when you want to offer that new food. That way the child feels comfortable and happy during that meal, so they might be more likely to eat the food. Or if you do it at a snack time, it could be that they just explore the food. They might not actually have to eat it at that time. With meals, we want to really think outside of the box as well. So thinking back to that binder factor of adding ketchup to our foods. Just because we think it would taste gross doesn't mean our child will. They may like different tastes that you and I may not like, but that's going to be the key to getting them to try that new food. For the do nots with meal preparation and expanding that food range, we want to not be deceitful about what your child is eating. Don't try to trick them into something because if they figure out that we're tricking them, they're not going to want to touch that food at all. We also don't want to offer another food after the meal has been offered. So if you've made the food, you've added in their safe food as well, and then your child kind of says, I want this food after. Try not to offer it because then they understand that this is within our meal time. We have a safe food for you, and maybe we can have that for the next meal. We also don't want to offer that new food at that child's worst meal. That's just setting up a negative association with that new food, and we want to focus on the positive. And then we also don't want to pressure or force your child to eat. So, thinking about the concept of 2 bites and then you can go. If you're forcing 2 bites onto that child, that's going to make them, again, add a negative association with that food so that they're not going to want to try it later on. We want to focus on that positive exposure so that they're going to want to eat it and want to eat it long term. So, looking at that aspect of food chaining, how are we able to build on that food that they're eating so that they might eat other things within that same category of the food that they like? So, food chaining is a strategy developed by Cheryl Franker, an SLP, and through this strategy, it aims to build on a child's preference to slowly expand their food range. The goal is to create links between food that the child currently accepts and those that are new by acknowledging their sensory preferences. So, creating links or chains between those foods that are already accepted and those that are new help to expand that variety of food in their diet. But it also takes into account their sensory processing profile and their current preferences. So, since feeding involves all the sensory systems, we think sight, smell, touch, sound, and taste, we want to think about eating as another sensory task that a child may face, and it can be really tricky. So, with food chaining, we look at based on the relationship between that food and drink, the similarities with regard to taste, flavor, texture, shape, color, temperature, and smell, which we are now going to be all experts at analyzing right now. So let's look back at that food range list. Are there any patterns between those flavors of foods? Does the child seek strong or bland food? What is the most common flavor of food that they enjoy? Do they like spicy? Do they like sweet food? Once you've identified that similarity between those foods, you can start chaining your child's food and ultimately make eating successful and enjoyable. That sounds easy, right? It's not going to be easy at the start, but we're going to slowly start to build this into your routine. So, where do we start? We're going to look at picking a food from your child's preferred food list. If your child only has one reliable preferred food, do not start with that. We want to pick something that instead on the sometimes preferred food. We don't want to work with their only preferred food because if we change that too much, it's going to remove that from their food diet, and that's something that we don't want to do. So let's start at something of a preferred food. Or we can also present it on a normal plate and present a slightly altered version beside it or on another plate. We don't want to risk as well losing that only preferred food. So we want to have it in the regular form, but just change it slightly, but maybe don't include it on that regular plate that the child's eating from. Another way that we can chain the food is just to make a noticeable change in the food. So every child may like a little bit of change, or some may tolerate a little bit more of change. That threshold's going to be different each and every time. So for some children, this might mean adding small amounts of 1 teaspoon of Greek yogurt into their regular yogurt. And then over time, adding a little bit more so that you're slowly changing that texture and that taste just a little bit. Or you can change the presentation of that exact same food. So a child tolerates Greek yogurt and that vanilla flavor. Well, let's try the strawberry flavor this time. So we're just going to make a slightly noticeable difference. That color is going to be different and that taste may be different. If a child doesn't tolerate that change right off the bat, again, slowly make that transition. So it might be that strawberry Greek yogurt that's half mixed with vanilla Greek yogurt so that that strawberry taste isn't too much of a taste difference, but then that color is also going to be a little bit different. So when food chaining, it's important to make changes gradually. As we mentioned throughout all these presentations, that process can take time, but it's also important to celebrate that small success. It's also important not to change too many variables at once. So stick with changing one variable if possible, such as changing the shape, flavor, or color. That way, we're not going to change it too much for them at once, and then we can slowly change it over time. We also want to look at offering small portions of that new food along with what your child already eats. Again, that's looking at that exposure piece. And they may not eat it right away, and that's okay. Even if a child touches it, that's okay. That's a win. The visual of an eating ladder can help express that exposure. So, this is how we know if a child's going to progress with trying new foods. So if we look at the bottom, we're going to look at tolerating the food on the learning plate. So that's going to be having that food even in the vicinity of the child. If they tolerate it with them on that learning plate, maybe after 20-ish exposures, we can move it to their own plate. And then sometimes children will slowly move up this kind of eating ladder until they get confident enough to actually eat and swallow the food. For some kids, it might not be very linear, and they might actually tolerate it on their plate and then go right to eating it. It's all going to be dependent on the child and how confident they feel on trying that new food, but this is a sequential ladder that we can think of when exposing new foods. So a child likes to be close to a food, but maybe they're not ready to put it in their mouth. Well, they can touch it, they can feel it and see what's it about the food that they like and relate it to what's similar to the food that they were already eating. So, for example, a child may like French fries, and then you're introducing it in a new form, such as a potato. Well, if you look inside of a French fry, it's going to be very similar to what's inside of a potato. So we can look at smelling the food. They smell pretty similar. Now let's touch the food and look at the food and talk about what's similar with it. This is all about that exposure piece to help make that child more aware and understanding of the food so that eventually they might feel more confident enough to actually eat it. You can also consider that sensory hierarchy. So, as I mentioned in relation to that potato and French fry example, looking at what about the food that they like, and then that sensory exposure piece a little bit as well to understand the food a little bit more. So here's some examples of different sensory language that you could use in your next meal to help with that exposure piece. So what does the food look like? Can you poke that food with your fork? What is the texture like? What else should we try with eating? So we've reached the end of our expanding food range portion of our selective eating workshop. So in this presentation today, we targeted some big topics. We talked about with meal presentation, how you present the food to the child. We talked about looking at the food that they're actually eating and how we can chain it to try adding more foods into their diet. And then we also talked about the eating ladder. So thinking about that exposure piece with food and that it doesn't always have to mean eating the food. It can be just exploring that sensory concept of food and that over time we can help build that new food into that child's diet. This is the end of our selective eating workshop. We hope that through these presentations, you've helped to build a toolbox of strategies to try out during your next meal time. Here are some additional resources that you could look at to help learn more about food chaining and other aspects about building a mealtime. Thank you.